Now we get into the Fifth Doctor era. Will be much shorter now, and it's the same formula as before, so let's get into it. First, with our mediocre stories, is number 20, and that is Kinda. I didn't realize that this was actually a fan favorite until way after I watched it, and I can't really figure out why. Honestly, it was pretty boring and not incredibly memorable. From the small parts I do remember are the really cerebral parts with Tegan in the first episode, and that was really cool, hence why this doesn't get a bad rating, as well as an interesting solution to the actual problem with the giant snake. But outside of that, I don't really remember much of the story. There was some native tribe, human explorers being assholes because reasons, and honestly, that's about it. Really a struggle to remember this one, so I'm just going to move on to the next one, because there is very little to say. Next is number 19 with, ironically, Snake Dance. This story is a bit better, but it still isn't really that great. It has Tegan becoming evil under the control of the Mara, and that right there isn't very hopeful for this story. While the plot was actually somewhat interesting this time with the world and the idea of a prophecy and the history of the Mara in this culture, I still found it to be somewhat forgettable. Like, I have a hard time remembering specific story beats and that sort of thing. It does have a decent premise, some colorful characters, and an overall decent story, but it comes off as a rather forgettable one despite doing some things better than its predecessor. Next is number 18, which is The Awakening. This is one of those stories where I feel it didn't know what it wanted to be. Like, it really wanted to be a pseudo-historical, but it also really didn't. It has knights fighting and all that fun stuff, but it's a reenactment. Like, it takes a half step with its historicalness. I mean, I majorly respect it for what it's trying to do, but its execution felt off. Like, it would have been better if it actually took place during the English Civil War. However, I still majorly respect it for trying to do something different. With that, the story is fine. Not great, but fine. I like the threat and its use of time travel, and the story was quick and to the point. Even though there was some stretches of not a whole lot happening, they do die down rather quickly. It was a bit anticlimactic as well. Overall, not incredibly great, but it does have some highlights that prevent it from being truly terrible. Number 17, and it is Time Flight. Not the worst the Fifth Doctor has to offer. While the effects and production design is quite terrible, and the handling of Adric's death was unforgivable, I didn't totally hate this one. It did kind of remind me of The Faceless Ones in terms of the setting and some alien influence. However, instead of planes being taken to a spaceship, they're taken to a long time into the past, which is an interesting idea, as well as the Master being showcased quite well here as well, despite the rather insensitive disguise he takes for some of the serial. It's not amazing or anything, but I don't get the whole unrelenting hate that this gets. It's a pretty fun story, and a rather simple one, as well as a rather good appearance from the Master. Next is number 16, which is Frontios. I think while the story, for the most part, is good, I found the story as a whole to be very forgettable. Like, reading into the story to refresh my memory, I am reminded that it was a good story with a decent villain twist, a decent setting besides a mediocre production design, and an okay story, but for the most part, I just found it to be forgettable. I did, however, like the stuff with the TARDIS and how the villains affected it. That was quite interesting. However, I don't really remember much about it, so I feel like I really can't say anymore, despite some interesting things about it when my memory is refreshed. Now we get into the good stories with number 15, and it is Terminus. Yeah, it's certainly not one of the better ones, but I still rather enjoyed it. It gets points mainly in the premise and setting, as well as being pretty enjoyable. I like the stuff with the leper colony, the giant beast thing not being a creature that kills people, an anti-corporation message, and it has an overall fun adventure vibe. I like how it has some post-apocalyptic ideas as well, some of the action, and I do think Nissa's goodbye was at least a little emotional. It's not great, as it is cheesy in many areas. There are stretches where it seems like nothing is happening, and the Black Guardian stuff being shoehorned in there. As I said though, the premise of this being a leper colony with evil guards and a beast that lurks in the shadows that is more than people realize, I like that stuff. And I also like the setting of the ship and how claustrophobic and kind of creepy it was. It is certainly the weakest of the Black Guardian trilogy, but I still think it was quite an enjoyable serial despite many shortcomings. Next is number 14, and it is Castrovalva. Definitely the weakest post-regen story so far, although it's pretty much downhill from here. I do respect the fact that it does try to be experimental and do different things and make the companions more important, but I feel as though it still didn't work. Mainly because the story doesn't revolve around the Doctor trying to showcase himself to the audience. It does revolve around him, but not as himself. It more so revolves around the idea of him, like he's almost treated as like this high-tier MacGuffin than us trying to get a feel for his doctor and how we think of him. I know that he's not technically a MacGuffin, but that's the closest thing I can think of in terms of describing his role in the story. He's not a person, he's just sort of seen as an item that needs protecting. On top of that, despite being the main villain, the Master somehow feels very forced into this story. Like it was already incredibly overstuffed, yet the Master, despite being integral to the plot, still almost feels superfluous, and his defeat is very anticlimactic. So you're probably wondering, how the hell is this under good when all I've done is shit on it? Well, I do like the experimentalism and when the Doctor is actually allowed to be the Doctor. So there is that. Parts of the story are quite good, and how Adric is technically a villain was an interesting idea. However, it does somewhat fall flat in terms of the Master of the story, and the Doctor not being allowed to be himself for a lot of the story. Next is number 13, which is Resurrection of the Daleks. While the weakest of the 80s Dalek trilogy, I do think it did some rather good things with its story. I appreciate how dark it is, and it was well executed in that respect. I also really like the start of the Dalek Civil War, and how that bleeds into the other two stories, and Davros' return was a bit better executed here. Like, I feel as though he has a purpose in the story rather than in Destiny of the Daleks. Unfortunately, it is inhibited by poor pacing and a weak story. Due to the fact that this is 2 45-minute episodes, it felt a lot longer and drier than if it was 4 25-minute episodes. And with that, it felt a bit more boring and not as brisk, even though it's technically shorter in length. As I said, it also suffers from a rather weak story. While I do like parts of it, like with Davros and the Dalek Civil War, everything else just felt weak to me. Like the stuff with Lytton wasn't incredibly interesting because you know what's going to happen. I appreciate that the Doctor and company was almost superfluous to the overall story, but it didn't create a terribly interesting story. I think that Caves of Androzani did the idea of a superfluous Doctor and companion in a story better. So while it does some good things and has plenty of highlights and good ideas, as a whole, it's just fine. Number 12 is The King's Demons. This is a story I wanted to like more, but it does somewhat fail. Mainly because it's pretty much an inferior remake of The Time Meddler, but with the Master instead of the meddling monk. It is a fun little scourge with the TARDIS crew and has the introduction of a companion that was unfortunately never used properly. However, it's irksome how it doesn't really do anything new, unique, or interesting. It's just kind of an easy story to watch, I guess. But the main problem is the fact that there is a much more interesting story that you could be watching instead of this. Not bad, in fact, pretty good, but it's a serial tarnished by lack of an interesting story and being a weaker version of something a hell of a lot better. Number 11 is Forward to Doomsday. This one was pretty damn good. It does suffer from some pacing issues at times, but for the most part, it is quite good. I really like the setting, as I feel this is almost what an early spaceship would look like, wall to wall with different dials and buttons, while also being extremely claustrophobic, even though in-universe it's the complete opposite. I also like the villains in this serial. It's as simple as their planet becoming unstable for life, so they plan to not only live on Earth, but take it over. Nothing super grandiose, just the Doctor and company trying to stop a takeover. I like the supporting characters too. They were all memorable and distinct characters. Overall, it was pretty much just an interesting and fun adventure. Although I will say the climax is a bit laughable, but again, I can't condemn it too much. Now we get to the very good stories with number 10, and it is Black Orchid. Definitely a more underrated fare that uses its episode count a little better than something like The King's Demons. I feel as though The King's Demons didn't take advantage of its story and was more so just going through the motions. Here they decided to go for a period piece murder mystery, and despite some slow points, I found it to be damn good. While there isn't a lot to this story, I feel as though it did offer some interesting ideas, like Nissa's doppelganger framing the Doctor and making a pure historical after they were long retired, was all really interesting. While the ending is a bit anticlimactic, I think it's safe to say no one expected it to be as grandiose or anything like that, so I think it was well executed for what it was going for. It's not one of the greatest stories ever, but I still really enjoyed it and still thought it was very good. Number 9 is The Five Doctors. This story is sort of just the epitome of fun. Unlike The Three Doctors, where it was more so about the story and character interactions, this was more about the celebration of Doctor Who. While it does lose points for me there, because one of the best parts of The Three Doctors is the interactions between 2 and 3, this one did have a very fun vibe despite the fact that there was little interaction between the Doctors. I like each of the storylines between all their Doctors, I like the companions chosen, and while the twist was very obvious, I still didn't mind it. I liked Richard Hurndall's portrayal and how he pretty much does his own thing without copying Hartnell's portrayal too much. which I very much appreciated. He still had a touch of that charm that Hartnell had, but he does his own thing. David Bradley's performance is very similar to that idea of doing his own thing that's definitely a long ways off. This is sort of the pinnacle of a story where I kinda have to lose criticism and analysis because all it is the celebration of a show that's been going on for 20 years. It's not intended to be a genuinely great story, but because of that, it does end up being very good, if that makes sense. It probably doesn't, but it kinda just makes sense when you watch it. Now we get to great stories with number 8, and that is The Visitation. While I don't think it's as great as people say it is, it's still a genuinely great story. I think there is good balance between pseudo and historical. It had a good mystery to the whole thing. I liked the setting, and the villains were quite good. I also really like the robot design. I know it wasn't executed as well as the designers intended. I still think it was a pretty cool design, and the attempt was there. If I had anything bad to say about this serial is that the pacing was a little off at points, the costumes for the creatures weren't very good, and Richard Mace was an ungodly annoying character. The accent was ball-gratingly annoying, and I wanted him to just fucking die after a certain point. However, outside of that, the story was great. I think it did have several shortcomings that prevent it from being better, but for the most part, I felt it was a genuinely great story. Next is number 7 with Planet of Fire. I really like this story because I think everything is just kind of top-notch in this story. There isn't really anything bad I have to say about it, you know? I think the introduction of Perry was a bit forced, but outside of that, nothing really all that bad. I really like the setting of Sarn and how the world operates, as well as how everything unravels in terms of Chameleon, the Master's plan, how Turlo factors into everything, what these people are, the Tremors, and Perry's own little scourge as well. There are a bunch of plot lines, but I never felt it was confusing or badly paced in any way. It's a little slow in the beginning with the stuff with Perry, but outside of that, I don't have anything really all that bad to say about it. It's not one of the greatest stories ever, it's not amazing or really great, I just think it executed its story really well, and I think it worked. Next is number 6 with Warriors of the Deep, another universally disliked story very high up. This is just one of those stories where I couldn't help but like it. I thought the Silurians and Sea Devils were well utilized, even though I disliked the fact that the Sea Devils were more so the underlings to the Silurians, and wore very terrible looking costumes. But I imagine that they would be more so equals, and while there are points of that in the story, just the overall idea of ordering the Sea Devils around was disingenuous to such a great villain, even though I didn't like their original story. What I did like about the story is that it felt like a cheesy 50s B-movie in the best possible ways. While the production design is very uninspired, it still kind of worked with what they were going for, or at least what they unintentionally went for. The supporting characters weren't incredibly interesting, and the subplot with them was much of the same. The Merca costume wasn't very good and pretty cheesy, but I felt it was cheesy just enough to work, and I think it worked in favor of the story. But despite this, I do like how it did interweave some darker ideas and themes into the story as well, especially the ending. Holy shit, the ending was great. It's just a sucker punch to the senses, and I absolutely love it. Although production of the episode did suffer a lot of problems, and it was probably unintentional that it ended up as cheesy as it was, I still liked it, and I do think it did kind of work, as well as the darker ideas and ending. Number 5 is Modern Undead. I think the best thing about this story is its use of time travel. The fact that it takes place in 2 different times and how things build up from there was extremely well executed. Well, how it goes from time to time and how we slowly figure out the mystery of what's going on in terms of the story and the Brigadier was very, very good. The story itself was pretty interesting in terms of what the actual plan and villain was. It again builds upon some sort of Time Lord lore with the villain and was rather simplistic despite the convoluted time travel physics. I do think that the Black Guardian stuff is a bit forced in there and didn't really need to be a part of all this, but it was still better executed here than in Terminus. I also didn't care for the ending as it was a bit anticlimactic, but I think those are some small nitpicks to an overall very great and creative story. Next is number 4 with Enlightenment. Ironically, the last part of the Black Guardian trilogy. This is easily the best one of the trilogy because the inclusion of the Black Guardian stuff didn't feel forced and actually served a point. I feel at least. I also really liked the story and the lore it brings to the overall universe in terms of the Eternals. They are so bored with immortality and being celestial beings that they are forced to entertain themselves with lesser beings and using them as pawns in a chess game. The concept of immortality is treated as a punishment, similar to Modern Undead, and treated so horrifically that Turlo tries to commit suicide rather than becoming immortal. Pretty fucking dark. There is so much size to the serial, you definitely feel the epic scale, mainly in the episodes after the first. The overall story is a bit weak in some places, but I feel as though the serial more than makes up for it with style and scale. I found the night scenes outside of the ship to be really cool looking, as well as creating an interesting balance of period piece production design and futuristic space production design. Overall, I thought this was a very well executed story in terms of themes, tone, style, and world building. The story is a bit weak in some areas, but for the most part, it's still quite great. Next is number 3, and that is Arc of Infinity. I think this serial has a lot of things going for it. Mainly, it doesn't have Tegan for most of the first episode, and so that is a major plus. I think it's really interesting when it comes to Time Lord lore, as well as the reintroduction of Omega. While the costume here is pretty stupid looking and not nearly as good as it was in the Three Doctors, I think the performance and plan he has more than make up for it, despite the twist being fairly obvious. I also think that Colin Baker here before he becomes the Doctor was actually quite excellent, and you can even tell here that his acting was one-upping Davison on many occasions. It does have plenty of cheesy moments, and it's not the greatest story-wise, but I still think it's quite great in many areas, like building the world of the Time Lords and their lore, which I'm always a sucker for. And for the plan, the villain, the overall story, lack of Tegan in the first episode, and Baker's performance are very much highlights. However, it does suffer from some pacing issues later on in the story, the obvious twist, and a ridiculous costume, as well as that weird bird creature in the crypt. However, despite everything, a rather great story. Now we get into the amazing stories with number 2, Earthshock. I was fairly impressed with this one, much to the surprise of no one. While the main gripes I have is that the choice of the Cybermen being the villains are superfluous, as they don't really act like Cybermen, nor are they necessary with the fact that they are Cybermen. It could have been any other villain, and it would have been just as good, as well as the fact that episode 2 is a bit slow. However, outside of that, this is a near-perfect serial. The great build-up, claustrophobia, atmosphere, and mystery of episode 1 to Adric's death in episode 4. It was brilliantly executed, exciting, tense, and overall just a superb story. The Cybermen are great in this story, even if they are a bit emotional at times. The story involving the Cybermen's plan to destroy Earth is simple yet well done. Adric's death is a bit melodramatic, however, I still think it works with the time and the story. Overall, it's one of the best of the Fifth Doctor era for a reason, and pretty much everything about the story is well done, with the exception of some pacing issues in episode 2, and the Cybermen being superfluous. However, still an amazing story. Now we get to number 1, and it is yet another predictable choice with The Caves of Androzani. This one was pretty obvious, wasn't it? So many people have stated so many times that this is easily the best serial from the Fifth Doctor era, as well as some polls by fans stating it's the best Doctor Who serial, period. While I wouldn't go that far, it's still an exemplary story. The setting is absolutely brilliant, the story works wonders, the villains, which is pretty much everyone, are superb. Especially Christopher Gable as Shiraz Jek, who is unbelievably creepy in all the right ways. In addition, the pace is also extremely well done, and Graham Harper executes a very film-like quality marvelously. I also love how the Doctor and Perry are pretty much superfluous to the story and the perfect execution of wrong place, wrong time. Robert Holmes brought his A-game to this story, and thank God JNT swallowed his pride to bring in a veteran writer to the program, because it really caused Davison to go out on a strong note, while his era was pretty middling for the most part. We'll get into that later. As I said, I love the setting in the actual caves, and the atmosphere is done exquisitely, as well as the pace, as I mentioned. It's quick and heart-pumping at times, and the tension is once again executed brilliantly. But it also gives time for the audience to breathe, like the more politically driven scenes in regards to the Spectrox and who is backing who and what the point of this war is really about. The thing is, though, similar to Genesis of the Daleks, everything great that has been said about the story has been said. I can't really add anything new to the praise because my praise is the same as everyone else's praise. So, sorry if I'm cutting it a bit short, but I feel as though I can't really add anything new to the massive amounts of praise this has already received. So, now moving on to companions. This is a bit of a tough one because one of the biggest problems with the Fifth Doctor era is the lack of good companions, but I'll still try my best to rank them. Last and certainly least, with no hesitation whatsoever, is Tegan Javanka. One of, if not the worst, classic Who companion of all time. She was ungodly annoying and had almost nothing to offer as a companion. She had the nickname of the mouth on legs, and that certainly describes her to a T. Her critique of the Doctor at certain points never had any heart to it. When it comes to companions critiquing the Doctor, whether that be playfully or seriously, there's always been a certain point to be said, or a certain heart to it, if you will. With Tegan, it just felt like she was blowing hot air in a ball-gratingly annoying voice. She did get a bit better in later seasons, but it came way too late, and I already made up my mind. And while she was better, she was still annoying and added very little to the TARDIS crew, but I will say her departure was well done. Next is Chameleon. He kinda should be towards the bottom just as default because he only appeared in 2 serials and not for very long. He kinda just shows up at the end of King's Demons and then dies in Planet of Fire. While he could have been something really cool and interesting due to the technical difficulties with the prop, we never really got that. So he stays towards the bottom of the 5th Doctor's companions, pretty much by default. Next is Zadric. As I stated before, I don't really hate him as a companion, but similar to Tegan, he never really added anything to the TARDIS crew, but additionally didn't really have good chemistry with Peter Davison. He was fine, nothing bad, but with 2 other companions, he didn't really do or give a lot in his small tenure as a 5th Doctor companion. There was a twinge of development in Earthshock, but it was only there for maybe some tension with the Doctor, so his death felt more tragic than it was. He was nothing bad, but nothing great either. Next is Peri Brown. Despite being with the 5th Doctor for only 2 serials, she was actually pretty good, mainly in her time in Caves of Androzani, where she showed a good relationship with the Doctor, and they had really good chemistry together. It felt like that they were with each other longer than they actually were, if that makes sense. But despite this, she is better as the 6th Doctor's companion, which we'll get into later. Next is Vyler Turlough. While with any other Doctor, Turlough might not have had an impression, here I think he works. Even though the Black Guardian trilogy wasn't as well executed as they wanted it to be, I still like the idea of an undercover agent trying to kill the Doctor while struggling with his own morals under a powerful influence. Even outside of that, I liked his companion after the fact. He had a good chemistry with the Doctor, had a bit of mystery to him, and overall was an intriguing and intelligent companion. And then, for the best companion of the 5th Doctor is Nyssa. While there were a lot of missed opportunities with her character, mainly with her dad becoming the Master essentially, I still really liked her as a companion. She was smart, resourceful, fun, interesting, had great chemistry with the 5th Doctor, and was overall a very great companion. She unfortunately had a lot of shortcomings with her character though, that prevents her from being one of the best companions ever though. Now we move on to the Doctor and his era. Now I did have some foreshadowing in regards to my feelings on this era, but now that I'm stating it, this has got to be my least favorite era of Classic Who. Watching this era felt like watching a mediocre TV show in the hopes that it gets better, and when it finally does, it gets cancelled. None of the stories were really all that memorable or incredibly interesting to me in any way. While I did rank plenty as great, in terms of the overall Classic era, they don't even come close to being ranked among the best of the best, with the exception of Caves and maybe Earthshock. Despite there being some great and even very good serials, comparatively they don't hold a candle to the Hartnell, Troughton, and Baker eras in my opinion. Hell, even though I'm not the biggest fan, even the Pertwee era was miles above this. All of it just felt kind of bleh, like a very bland edge to the whole thing. It also doesn't help with Davison's Doctor either. I never really connected with his Doctor on a deeper level that I connected with every other Doctor. Hartnell, Troughton, Pertwee, and Baker all had a moment where I said to myself, that's the Doctor. I never got that with Davison, not even in Caves of Androzani. It just felt like a guy saying he was the Doctor. In addition, there were other attributes to his Doctor that was done better, like the more human, down-to-earth, and personable Doctor I felt was done better with the 8th Doctor. With an old man in a young man's body, that was done leaps and bounds better with the 11th Doctor. I was also never a fan of the costume either. It seemed just as ridiculous as the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat of the 6th Doctor and the question mark pullover of the 7th Doctor. Not as bad, but still just as ridiculous. The 5th Doctor era for me is just this perfect storm of ideas not working. Peter Davison's Doctor wasn't very good, his companions weren't very good, the stories weren't as memorable or as great, and his era didn't really have a set shtick that could have made it a little more memorable. As I said before, there was a certain central idea that encapsulated each era. With the first, it's experimental. With the second, it's heavy sci-fi and alien planets. With the third, grounded Cold War thriller. With the fourth, gothic horror with a sci-fi edge. With the fifth, there wasn't really anything that stuck out as a central idea. Maybe heavy sci-fi, but with that, it felt just like a cheaper and discounted version of the 2nd Doctor era. So with all these attributes, almost nothing worked about the 5th Doctor and his era, for me personally. I just didn't care for it. So, that's the 5th Doctor and his era. Sorry to all you Davison fans out there, but he just didn't do it for me personally. He's definitely my least favorite Doctor, and I don't really plan on watching anything from his era anytime soon. His era wasn't very memorable, Davison never felt like the Doctor to me, his companions at best were a lost opportunity, and overall, nothing all that special. And with that, he is my least favorite Doctor. Yes, even less so than the next guy, which we'll get into next time.